Boston, Massachusetts, September 14th, 2019. The sky was clear that Saturday morning, and the air had a hint of crispness characteristic of early fall in Boston. The city was busy, but in that small church in the center, the atmosphere was one of expectation and joy. Emily and Jake had been together for 5 years, and that day marked the culmination of a relationship that, in the eyes of many, was perfect. Friends and family were already sitting on the benches, admiring the elegant decor. White flowers hung gracefully from the altars, and sunlight streamed through the colorful stained glass windows, painting the church floor in a soft rainbow. Jake was at the altar, surrounded by his groomsmen, but his expression was one of uneasiness. Every now and then, he adjusted his shirt collar, as if his suit was too tight. A best man, sensing the nervousness, whispered, "Relax, man. It's just pre-wedding anxiety." Jake laughed forcefully, but his eyes seemed distant, as if they were somewhere else. Outside the church, Emily's car arrived. She stepped out, radiant, in her wedding dress, the lace and pearl details reflecting the soft morning light. The guests stood up to the sound of the organ, ready for the moment they had all been waiting for. Emily began walking down the hallway with her father at her side, smiling as she looked at Jake. But something was wrong. Jake avoided his gaze. As she approached, something about Jake's face caught Emily's attention. It wasn't the passionate look of a groom about to get married. There was tension there. His forehead was furrowed. His lips were pursed. His eyes were almost hard. It was as if he was fighting an internal battle, something that no one else there could see. Emily arrived at the altar, and the two came face to face. The priest began the ceremony, following the usual script, while the guests looked on with looks of approval. But Emily could feel the heavy energy beside her. Jake wasn't well. He seemed distant, his thoughts wandering. She tried to ignore it, keeping the smile on her face while the priest said the blessings. When the moment for the vows arrived, Jake took a deep breath. It was what everyone was waiting for. Those romantic words that would make Emily cry with emotion and the guests sigh. But instead, he looked straight into her eyes and spoke in an unexpectedly cold tone. "Emily, before we go any further with this, I need to be honest with you. I can't go through with this charade." The guests froze. The priest, confused, interrupted his speech and looked askance at Jake. Emily froze, the smile fading from her face as bewilderment took over. What was he doing? Was this part of some kind of bad joke? Jake, without hesitation, continued, "I've been lying to you. To all of you." His voice shook slightly, but he kept his gaze fixed on Emily, as if this were the only moment of truth between them in a long time. Whispers began to circulate among the guests. A few looks of curiosity mixed with discomfort, and the whispers increased. The priest, clearly upset, tried to calm the situation, but Jake raised his hand, silencing him. Emily was still speechless, trying to process what was happening. For the last few months, Jake hesitated for a moment, and then, as if throwing cold water on the ceremony, he added, "I've been having an affair with the maid of honor." It was as if the air had been sucked out of the church. The silence that followed was deep and unsettling. Emily felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. She looked at Kate, her best friend and godmother, and saw the panic in her eyes. Everything made sense now. The furtive meetings, the lame excuses, the abruptly interrupted conversations. Jake was having an affair with his best friend, and he chose that moment at the altar, in front of everyone he loved, to reveal the betrayal. The murmurs turned into an uproar. Some people stood in disbelief at what they heard. Others gasped, trying to understand if it was real or a nightmare. Emily, now visibly shaking, could hardly believe her ears. Jake remained there, not moving, as if he was relieved to have the weight off his shoulders. Emily, her breathing uneven and her face pale, struggled to maintain her composure. She dropped the bouquet and looked at him with a mixture of anger and pain. Her voice finally came out, fragile and shaky. "Why? Why now?" Jake just stared at her, without a clear answer. The silence was broken by Emily's muffled sobs as she ran out of the church, tears streaming down her face. The guests were paralyzed, not knowing what to do. What was supposed to be the happiest day of her life had turned into her worst nightmare. As Emily ran through the church doors, all that could be heard was the echo of her footsteps fading into the distance, leaving behind a trail of pain, betrayal, and something even darker that no one there could predict. The big day was far from over. The next morning, the city seemed strangely silent to Jake. He was in his apartment, sitting on the couch, reliving the events of the previous day over and over in his mind. The decision to expose the case in front of everyone had been thoughtless, but he felt a confusing mix of relief and regret. It hadn't been the right time, but it was done. There was no going back. The phone rang incessantly. Messages and calls from friends, family, and even strangers piled up. The news spread quickly across social media, turning what was supposed to be a fairy tale wedding into a local scandal. Jake ignored all attempts at contact except one, Kate. Her voice on the other end of the line was desperate. "Jake, we need to talk now," she said, with the tone of someone who already knew something was about to completely fall apart. Not knowing what else might be revealed, he agreed to meet with her. They arranged to meet in a secluded park, away from the prying eyes and cameras that now followed Jake's every move. The secret he had revealed was just the tip of the iceberg. Something darker was coming. The sun was starting to sink below the horizon when Jake arrived at the agreed-upon location. The park was practically empty, with only a few joggers and cyclists rushing past, paying no attention to the two. Kate was already there, sitting on a bench away. When she saw him, her eyes were red from crying. Jake approached slowly, feeling the weight of guilt growing inside him. "You shouldn't have done that," she said bluntly as soon as he sat down next to her. His voice was low, but filled with anger and fear. "I couldn't take it anymore, Kate. I needed to end this. I needed to be honest, even if—" He hesitated, trying to find the right words, but nothing seemed right. Kate interrupted him, her tone more serious now. "It's not just about what you did yesterday, Jake. It's not just the fact that you destroyed the marriage and ruined Emily's life. It's what you did before." Jake froze. He knew what she was talking about. That secret, buried deep, that they had both sworn never to reveal. The secret that connected them in a much darker way than the simple extramarital affair. Kate's words fell heavily into the air. "If Emily finds out, if anyone finds out, we're both done for," she continued, looking around as if she feared someone might be listening. "You know what I'm talking about, Jake. The accident. Everything we hid. That was it. That accident. A night months ago that had started as something innocent. A party filled with alcohol and laughter, and ended in disaster. Jake and Kate were together that night, driving home after a night of drinking, when something unexpected happened. They ran over a man, a pedestrian crossing the street. It was late at night, and the street was deserted. Instead of providing help, amid panic and confusion, they fled. They left the man there, not knowing if he was alive or dead. The news of a pedestrian's death the next day was like a punch in the stomach. Jake and Kate knew they were responsible, but they never said anything to anyone. Until now, they had managed to keep it a secret. "I know, Kate, but no one needs to know. If we keep quiet, this will go away," Jake said in a desperate tone, trying to convince himself that it was true. Kate shook her head nervously. "You don't understand. The police are reopening the case. They think there is new evidence. If they find out we were involved, our lives are over." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. The nightmare he thought he had buried was resurfacing, with a vengeance. And now, on top of the wedding scandal, he had to deal with the imminent threat of being arrested for manslaughter. As they were arguing, a figure appeared in the distance, discreetly observing them. It was Emily. After the previous day's emotional breakdown, something inside her had changed. Shock and pain gave way to grim determination. She was no longer the vulnerable, betrayed bride. Now, she was looking for answers. And as she watched Jake and Kate together in that park, something inside her woke up. She knew there was more to the story than just the betrayal. There were hidden secrets, things that were being hidden from her and everyone else. And she was determined to find out the truth. As the sun set and darkness began to take over the park, Jake and Kate continued to discuss their options, unaware of Emily watching them. And at that moment, a thought came into her mind. Not only had they destroyed her life, But they were also hiding something much more dangerous. The secret was about to be revealed. And when that happened, nothing would be the same. Emily didn't sleep that night. Jake's betrayal still burned in her mind. But the scene she witnessed in the park with Kate added a new layer of perplexity. It wasn't just infidelity that connected them. There was something deeper, something dark, and Emily was determined to find out what it was. That Monday morning, Emily locked herself in her apartment, ignoring messages from worried friends and family trying to understand what had happened. His mind was focused on one thing: understanding what Jake and Kate were hiding. She was no longer the devastated bride. The betrayal had triggered something inside her, a need to move beyond the pain and seek justice, or revenge. Taking out her cell phone, she began to investigate. He mentally reviewed everything he knew about the last few months of his relationship with Jake. He tried to connect dots that previously seemed irrelevant. The late departures, the vague excuses, and now, that tense conversation between him and Kate in the park. She remembered the weeks when Jake seemed more distracted, more distant. Something happened during this period that she didn't realize at the time. Something they were hiding. So she did a quick internet search for recent accidents in Boston. Something prompted her to type those words. An intuition, perhaps. What she found left her perplexed. 3 months earlier, a man had been run over on a deserted street, and the driver fled without providing help. The case had gained attention in the media for a few days, but soon disappeared from the news due to a lack of evidence. The investigation was at a standstill, or at least it was until a week ago, when rumors surfaced that the police had new leads in the case. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. Could this be? Were Jake and Kate involved in this accident? Without hesitation, she picked up the phone and called an old college friend who worked as a journalist in Boston. Karen was known to have police contacts, and if anyone could get more information, it would be her. After a few minutes of conversation, Karen promised she would make a few calls and see what she could get. As she waited for Karen's response, Emily felt her stomach drop. She could barely eat, and anxiety made her body shake. Sitting on the couch, staring at her cell phone screen, her world seemed increasingly distorted. The people she trusted were turning out to be monsters, and now she felt like she was on the verge of discovering something far more disturbing than betrayal. Hours passed until the cell phone rang. It was Karen. "Emily, I got some information about the hit-and-run case," Karen began, in a serious tone. "The police actually reopened the case. They found new evidence, fragments of a rearview mirror, apparently from the getaway car. They're doing forensic analysis now, but more importantly, it looks like they have a lead on who might be involved. I didn't get details, but the police are watching some people." Emily held her breath. "And you think Jake might be involved in this?" Karen paused before responding. "I don't know, Emily, but if he was near that location the night of the accident, it's possible." Emily's mind was in turmoil. If Jake and Kate were involved in that accident, it wasn't just a betrayal of love, it was a crime. A serious crime that they were trying to cover up. She knew she couldn't just stand by and wait for the police to do their job. She needed to confront them. "I needed answers." With adrenaline pumping through her veins, Emily left the house and drove to Jake's apartment. She knew he would be there. "I needed to talk to him face to face. I needed to hear him confirm or deny everything that was going through his head. If there was anything left of the man she once thought about spending the rest of her life with, she would find out that night." Upon arriving at Jake's building, the doorman immediately recognized her and let her in. Emily's heart was racing as she walked up the stairs, ignoring the elevator. When he reached Jake's door, he hesitated for a brief second before knocking loudly. Jake opened the door with a surprised expression on his face. He was clearly exhausted, as if he hadn't slept since the wedding. Upon seeing Emily, his eyes widened. He hadn't expected to see her there. Not so soon. "Emily, what are you doing here?" His voice was low, almost cautious. She wasted no time. "We need to talk. Now." She entered the apartment without expecting an invitation, leaving Jake with no option but to follow her. The silence was heavy as they faced each other in the middle of the room. Emily finally broke the ice, her voice full of tension. "I know there is something else going on. Something you and Kate are hiding. And I'm going to find out what it is, Jake." Jake tried to maintain his composure, but his gaze betrayed his nervousness. He knew Emily was smart enough to put the pieces together. "I don't know what you're talking about, Emily," he said, his voice shaking slightly. Emily took a step forward, approaching him. "I know about the accident, Jake. I know you two were involved. Police are reopening the case. And now you will tell." Jake went pale. His breathing quickened, and he looked at the floor, unable to maintain eye contact. For a few seconds, silence took over the room, until finally he gave in. "Yes," he whispered, barely audible. "It was an accident, Emily. We didn't know what to do. We were terrified." Emily felt a wave of anger and disgust rise inside her. Everything she had thought about Jake, about their relationship, was crumbling before her eyes. "You let a man die, Jake, and you tried to hide it. How could you?" Jake shook his head, as if trying to justify his actions. "I wanted to tell you, I swear, but we were scared. If I confessed, I would lose everything." Emily looked at him, her voice cool and controlled. "And now you've lost everything." She left the apartment without looking back, leaving Jake alone with his guilt and his secrets. Outside, night had fallen over Boston, and the city seemed darker than ever. Emily knew this was far from over the truth. The week that followed was pure hell. Emily, consumed by a growing rage, felt like something inside her was breaking. The discovery of Jake and Kate's involvement in the accident had changed everything. What began as a romantic betrayal had turned into something much more sinister. And now, with every minute that passed, the tension increased. Jake was scared, and Kate seemed to be distancing herself further from the situation, as if trying to avoid the impending disaster. That Friday, gray clouds hung over Boston, mirroring the somber mood surrounding everyone involved. Emily knew the police were tightening their grip. Karen had gotten more information, confirming that Jake and Kate were, in fact, in the investigators' sights. They had already been summoned for testimony, and rumors were that their arrest could happen at any moment. But Emily couldn't wait for that. The anguish of knowing that Jake and Kate were free, living their lives while the weight of their actions went unpunished, was unbearable. She couldn't let go of the anger, the feeling of betrayal and injustice. That obsession with seeing the truth exposed grew more and more, and she began to imagine solutions more permanent. On September 21st, Emily received a text from Jake. He asked to meet. He said he wanted to resolve things, talk like adults, and that he was willing to tell the police everything. At first, Emily hesitated. Part of her knew that Jake might be trying to manipulate the situation to protect himself. But another part, the part that still wanted some kind of closure, decided to go. The meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. in a secluded cafe in downtown Boston. Emily arrived ahead of schedule, but, contrary to what she expected, she didn't feel her heart racing or her hands shaking. Instead, she felt strangely calm, almost cold, a calm that preceded the storm. Jake arrived minutes later, wearing a tired and haggard expression. He sat across from Emily, and for a moment, the two were silent. The ambient noise of the cafe, the voices and laughter around, made that conversation seem surreal, as if they were in a world apart. "Emily, I know I hurt you," Jake began, voice hoarse and low. "I don't know how I got to this point. I completely lost myself." She stared at him, expressing no emotion. "Did you get lost? A man is dead, Jake. This is more than getting lost." Jake sighed, running his hands over his face. I know, and I'm going to tell the police everything. I'm going to turn myself in this once and for all." "And Kate?" Emily asked, keeping her gaze fixed on his. "Is she going to confess too?" Jake hesitated, his gaze wavering. Kate is confused. She's scared. I don't know if she's ready to do that." Emily felt a knot form in her stomach. "Fear," she whispered, her voice full of contempt. "She should be scared. Both should." The silence between them became heavy again. Jake looked at Emily, as if he was waiting for some kind of answer or redemption. But she wouldn't give him that. No more. When Jake finally tried to speak again, Emily interrupted him, getting up from the table. "This is over, Jake," she said, her voice firm. "I'm not the person who's going to save you from this situation. You made your choice, Now deal with the consequences." She left the cafe before he could react, leaving Jake alone with his thoughts. But Emily knew that meeting was not the end. As he walked through the dark streets of Boston, his mind was filled with dark thoughts. Something inside her had changed irreversibly. The quest for justice had now become a quest for revenge. Later that night, as Emily wandered the streets, she received an unexpected call. It was Karen. The journalist seemed disturbed and hurried in her speech. "Emily, you won't believe it. I just discovered something. Police are suspecting that it was not a simple hit and run. They think it may have been intentional, and it appears there is evidence pointing directly to Kate." Emily stopped walking. The revelation hit her like a blow. "Are you saying it was premeditated?" "That's what it looks like," Karen confirmed. "Jake may not have been fully aware, but Kate, she knew what she was doing." Emily hung up the phone without answering. The anger he had been holding back all week finally boiled over. If Kate had planned the hit and run and kept it a secret, then everything she had gone through, all the pain and betrayal, had been because of a cold, calculated decision. The hatred inside Emily grew to a level she never imagined possible. And that night, she made a definitive decision. "I wouldn't wait any longer for the police. Jake might just be a piece in the puzzle, but Kate was the brains behind it all." The next day, Emily learned that Kate would be alone in her house. She went there unannounced, determined to confront the woman who had destroyed her life. What happened at that moment is still shrouded in mystery. All that is known is that, hours later, neighbors heard screams and the sounds of fighting. When the police arrived, it was already too late. Kate was found dead in the living room. Emily was there, in shock, sitting next to the body. She didn't say a word as she was taken away by the police, her eyes blank and distant. Reporters' cameras captured the moment she was escorted out of the house without any resistance. The case quickly made headlines: "Fatal Revenge. Cheated bride kills woman linked to fatal hit-and-run case." Judgment Day had finally arrived. The case that shocked Boston and divided opinion across the country was about to reach its conclusion. The weeks following Kate's murder were full of speculation, heated social media debates, and newspaper headlines. For many, Emily was a woman destroyed by betrayal and grief. To others, she was a cold-blooded killer who had decided to take the law into her own hands. The courtroom was packed that morning, everyone anxiously waiting to hear the verdict. Emily entered the courtroom with a calm expression, although her gaze remained empty, lifeless. She was escorted by 2 police officers, her hands handcuffed in front of her body. As she sat down next to her lawyer, the sound of cameras and whispers filled the room, and she kept her gaze fixed on the floor. The prosecutor began his argument firmly, painting a relentless picture of Emily as a woman who, although she had suffered, had planned and carried out a premeditated act of violence. He recalled the grim details of the night of Kate's murder, mentioning evidence of a fight, testimony from neighbors who heard screams, and the lack of defensive markings on Kate's body, suggesting she had no chance to fight. "Emily did not act on impulse," the prosecutor declared, pacing back and forth in front of the jury. "She went to Kate's house with a clear purpose: revenge. This is not just a case of an emotionally wounded woman. This is brutal, calculated murder. She knew what she was doing." Across the room, the defense lawyer, a middle-aged man with a serious expression, waited patiently for his turn. When he finally stood up to speak, his approach was completely different. Yes, Emily was in shock, in mourning, and yes, her actions led to the death of a woman. "But I want you, the jury members, to consider the context," he began, his voice calm, almost compassionate. "This is not a pure and simple revenge story. This is the story of a woman who was betrayed in every way possible. First, for her fiancé. Then, by the woman she thought was her friend. And finally, for the truth about his brother's death. The loss of his brother was the breaking point. Emily wasn't just emotionally betrayed. She was destroyed by these people. The night of Kate's death was not premeditated. Emily went to her house in a state of despair. What happened there was a tragedy, but it was not a cold-blooded murder. During the trial, the defense presented evidence of the psychological trauma Emily had suffered over the past few months. They brought in experts who testified to the devastating impact of his loss, drawing a parallel between his mental state and the violence that followed. Furthermore, the defense lawyer highlighted that Emily had been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder and that her judgment was compromised at the time of the crime. Emily's testimony was one of the most emotional moments of the trial. When she was called to the witness stand, the courtroom was completely silent. She spoke in a restrained manner, her voice low and monotone as she recounted the events that led up to that fateful night. "I went to Kate's house to confront her," Emily explained, her eyes fixed on some distant point. "I wanted answers. I wanted her to admit what she had done, to at least show some regret. But when I got there, she seemed so indifferent, so remorseless. I lost control. I don't know at what point everything got so out of control. I didn't plan to hurt her, but by the time I realized, it was too late." The court listened in silence, some spectators visibly moved by Emily's testimony. Others, however, maintained a hard expression without showing empathy. The prosecution insisted on portraying Emily as a vengeful woman, manipulating the trauma narrative to justify a terrible act. The defense struggled to show Emily as a victim of circumstances, someone who had been pushed over the edge. When the moment of the verdict arrived, the suspense in the room was palpable. The jury had spent 3 days in deliberation and were now ready to reveal their decision. Emily sat motionless as the judge asked the jury's spokesman to read the verdict. For the crime of second-degree murder, as charged, Emily Carter, the jury finds her guilty. A murmur passed through the room. The prosecutor exhaled in relief, while the defense lawyer closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing the defeat. Emily didn't react. She remained seated, her expression unchanged, as if she already knew what was coming. The judge determined the sentence, 20 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 12 years. He stated that while he acknowledged Emily's trauma, the fact was that a life had been taken, and that could not be ignored. As Emily was led out of the courtroom, cameras captured every moment. She walked with her head high, but without showing any emotion. The media followed her intensely, describing her as the woman who went from cheated bride to murderer. Emily Carter's case was one of the most talked about cases of 2019 and 2020. Her actions divided opinions and raised debates about how far betrayal and grief can take a person. Some saw her as a victim who lost everything and reacted tragically. Others considered her a criminal who chose the path of revenge. The trial ended, but Emily Carter's story would continue to resonate for years to come.